Hi, and welcome to Condemned and Happy, a podcast for people struggling with religious trauma and for those who care about them. Today, I am joined by Berta, who does our webpage support and will soon be graduating with a degree in digital media. For first-time listeners, my name is Kim, and I am an ordained pastor in the ELCA, which is a more liberal or progressive form of Christian religion. When we first talked about this episode, it was going to be about the broader topic of what structures make a safer worshiping community. I was thinking we would talk about theology, and Berta, you found that interesting because you had a different approach to this topic. Would you mind sharing your approach and why it led us to the topic of ADHD and religious trauma?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So I wasn't interested really in theology as much. I have studied it some, but for me, when it came to church experiences, the way that the services were, the way that the services were structured seemed a bigger concern to me and the
Mm-hmm.
overall environment of the worship place.
Okay.
As a person with ADHD, the concept of sitting in services and being quiet and not really being able to voice or your thoughts or to move around is very difficult for me. And I think that's what kind of led us to the topic of ADHD.
Yeah, and for context, when you're talking about the services, let's talk about the structure of the services you grew up in. So you mostly remember services from more of a northern church background,
Yes.
Pennsylvania and New York.
Yeah.
And tell me what that was like. Was it one service and then you go home? Was it a pre-service type thing or a Bible study type thing? And then a worship service? What was it like?
Yeah. So the church that my family attended in Pennsylvania was very unique in some ways. It wasn't necessarily the type of church that we went to in New York.
Okay.
This church was like hours away or an hour away
Right.
or so. So we had to travel a while to get there, and we just went to the main service. I don't know if they had other services
Okay.
because I was young and I just can't remember what kind of things went on at the church, what kind of things they
Right.
offered.
So you would be in a car seat, strapped
Hmm.
in, and then you
Yeah.
travel about an hour or more.
I don't think it was more than an hour, but definitely more than an hour in a day, like around 2 hours.
Okay.
That's what, at least as far as I can remember. It's probably more like 45 minutes, but as a kid, it feels like
It felt like an hour. Yeah.
hours, hours. And
Because
not to
one of the
mention,
times,
I get really bad motion sickness, which I didn't know at the time.
yeah.
So my only saving grace was like stale animal crackers and hand sanitizer. So that was my experience in the kind of the Pennsylvania one. I think the services were pretty long. I don't remember really.
Okay.
I mean, I have more memories once we moved to New York.
And what was that like, service wise?
Service wise, they pretty much always had what was called Sunday school at the beginning of the worship services, I guess. And this would
Okay.
be an hour or two before the main services, like an
Okay.
hour and a half or something before the main services. And it usually involved classes for adults and children, and usually they'd be separated.
Okay.
Uh, we weren't always a part of that, but at some point we were.
Okay. So the reason I asked that question is that in the broad spectrum of Christian religions, the services vary in length.
Hmm.
So in the ELCA, you're looking at a worship service that's going to be anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour 15 if we do the
Mm-hmm.
entire liturgy and have communion. When you're in a Lutheran service, most people who are Lutheran remember that when they're growing up as kids, that they sat down and stood up a lot
Mm. Interesting.
because there are parts of the liturgy where you are standing. So you stand whenever you sing a song, you stand for
Yes.
prayers, And then you sit down
Yeah,
when
true.
when things are read, like
Yeah.
lessons are read, and you sit for the sermon. But you stand for the creed. So there are structured up, down in the service.
Mm.
Were you guys expected to sit the whole time?
So we did have standing during select songs and sometimes
Okay.
for prayer. There was, it feel like the beginning half of the main service, it felt like, 15 to 20 minutes of like standing up and sitting down and having people pray and singing songs and all this stuff.
Okay.
After that, the main service started. Usually, before the main service started, if there was a children's service for the kids, they would be dismissed to go, and then the main like sermon would start.
Okay.
The sermon was usually supposed to be around 45 minutes. Sometimes it went longer. I know it was supposed to be an hour, I think ish altogether,
Oh,
but like
wow.
the singing and song the with the singing and the sermon, like at least it
Okay.
was supposed to be around an hour, but usually ran longer than that by like it could have been as long as 15 to 20 minutes longer.
So I'm going to respond why I was laughing at 45 minutes. In our clergy classes, we were
Mm-hmm.
taught that because Americans' attention has shortened, that
Mm.
we should go no longer than 15 minutes.
I would agree with
And
that.
that 9 to 10 was more
Mm-hmm.
impactful. Most television shows only keep attention for 7 minutes. So our
Yeah.
sermons would vary in length. You would kind of adjust it based on that. And you also adjust it based on how many people start checking out. It's like, okay, I
Yeah.
need to wrap this up because, you can see that people are checking out. So I can't imagine trying to talk straight through for 45 minutes or trying to
I
listen to them.
I don't know for sure what the main structure was because I'd have to like go back in my mind, but this is what it felt like to me.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say that it was longer than it should have been for sure by a lot.
I I went in college, I went to a couple of times to a Baptist church and to a
Hmm.
non-denominational church. And honestly, it did feel like they preached for a long time. It was very different than what I experienced. I went 1 year and then I went a year later, and he was still preaching like from one verse from Hebrews, the book of
Hmm.
Hebrews, and he went on for 40 minutes on one
Yeah.
verse. And to this day, so that was over 30 years ago, to this day, I
Yeah.
don't like the book of Hebrews. I avoid it.
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah.
because it was like, And in our tradition, we don't read just one verse and preach from it. We
Hmm.
read Old Testament scripture, Psalm, a letter from Paul or the other apostles, and then a
Hmm.
gospel reading.
Yeah.
And they have a connection thematically, but
Yes.
you can focus on one text. So
Yeah. There was
those
none of that type of structure for us.
so if you zoned out during one of the readings, and the readings wouldn't be very long, they might be 2 to 3 minutes.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
then the psalm, when it's read, it's not read straight through. The congregation reads one part and the leader reads another part. So it's
The
back
call
and
and
forth.
answer.
Yeah. It's kind of, yeah, it's kind of like that. Or sometimes it's chanted depending on the season and whether or not you have someone who has the voice to do it. Because,
That's kind of cool.
yeah, like the Gospel of John can be chanted the entire thing. Because early on in churches, they didn't have sound systems, and that's how the priest could be heard.
Yeah.
And it's great if you have a male voice. If you have a so-so female voice, it's hard to do. Like
Hmm.
really, really good female singers can do it. I can't. Nope.
Uh,
But it that way it carries. The
yeah.
sound carries further.
Yeah,
Um,
the sermon structures in our church were more like they find like one passage or part of the Bible that like spoke to them or for whatever reason they felt like they wanted to talk about. And then they would sometimes find other passages to help support whatever idea they had to share. That was basically
okay.
how they were structured.
Okay. Now, you have ADHD. How old were you when you were diagnosed with ADHD?
So I was able to get my diagnosis around when I was around 27 years old, I believe. I'm not exactly
Okay.
sure the exact date, but it was one of those things where pretty much everybody knew that I had ADHD growing up that knew me as a child. And it was a big question mark in my mind because I'd never actually seen anybody to get it checked out to see if I was or not. And it wasn't until I moved out with my spouse that I actually was able to pursue the diagnosis.
Okay.
And thankfully, he was very supportive in that. I was going to say, which it's not actually uncommon for AFAB or assigned female at birth with people and women to not get an ADHD diagnosis until later in life.
Yeah, because it presents differently in women than it does in men.
Yeah, and probably also misogyny, but you know.
There is that. How does having an ADHD diagnosis help you manage yourself? I mean, does that kind of like put the pieces together? Is it like an aha moment?
It when I first got diagnosed, even though I was pretty sure I had it, it felt really like heavy, I guess.
Okay.
But now that I have it, I realize that it basically unlocks the doors to get support for I need to get support. It's very validating, I guess, to know that what I'm experiencing isn't just in my head. It's something that people have recognized and they've studied and they understand. And, am in school. So being able to access, or at least have the possibility to access accommodations that would be helpful for me. And, it's not, I'm not stupid or anything. I have
Right.
ADHD. It's good to know that.
Yes, a lot of people with ADHD tend to be high performers and can almost mask it with good
Mhm.
grades. But it also depends on the severity because it seems to be a very much a spectrum with ADHD. So we talked a little bit about the church structure growing up. Do you have any memory about how long those services were? And what were the expectations placed on you?
So the services, I think, as far as I remember, each service, like the morning service, the main service, and then there was also an evening service as well. All of them
Okay.
were supposed to be around an hour. Keeping things to an hour always seemed to be a challenge. The
Okay.
services, like I mentioned before, involved singing, getting up, sitting down, getting up and sitting down, and but you always remain you just assume to remain in the same area in the same spot. You couldn't you weren't there was no expectation of you being able to get up and leave. It was almost like the thought that if you left that you were being offensive or like you were disagreeing with what was being said, kind of thing. That was the kind of feeling that was put out there.
Did you get people staring at you when you would leave? Or
I
did you
don't
felt
know,
like you do?
but I felt
Okay.
like it.
Okay.
One of the churches they went to had hardwood floors. A lot of the churches do have like the harder floors. So
Hmm.
if you wanted to be discreet, if you needed to leave at all, it was very difficult, particularly if you're wearing fancy shoes.
Yeah.
So there, basically, if you were anything younger than a child, you were expected to sit still and listen and to say like the things when they were asked to be said or to sing when everybody was singing. There was very little room for a give and take exchange, which I think is kind of normal in a way.
Okay. So for many children with ADHD, well, even non-ADHD kids, sitting still for long periods of time is almost impossible. And
It's difficult.
some, it's very, yeah. in some congregations, children are dismissed partway through church.
Hmm.
And usually it's children that are preschool through, say, grade 6 might
Hmm.
be dismissed. Some churches have a wiggle spot or a playground for families who have young children and they don't want to dismiss them so that the kids
Hmm.
can move around. And usually there's like a soft kind of toys to play there and kind of quiet toys. And some churches have a nursery in a separate room where the
Hmm.
service is able to be heard for the adults and kids can
Yeah.
play with age related toys. Were any of those options available to you or your parents?
Many of those options were available to my parents. There was usually a nursery available,
Mm-hmm.
although it was usually only meant for like toddlers or younger.
Okay.
So it was, very restricted. Like if you were a baby, you could go to the nursery. There was like a children's service where the children were dismissed. I was never allowed to go to that as a child. So I was always in the main service with the rest of the adults.
Okay.
Um, my parents made that decision. I do not necessarily think that was the best decision for me as a child, particularly with ADHD. But,
Yeah.
I had no choice in the matter. And I
Yeah.
just had to sit there through the services basically when they brought me. There was no wiggle spots, by the way. There was no like understanding of that specifically. There was because there was either you were in the service and you sat and you were quiet, or you had to leave basically. You
Okay.
couldn't really participate and move or, sit on the floor and play with a toy or anything. Like that had to be done
Okay.
either in a separate area,
Okay.
like, or not at all.
So in our communities, as more parents of kids with special needs have expressed the challenge of being part of a worshiping community, some congregations responded with sensory toys in autism bags and kid bags with
Hmm.
activities that kids enjoy and are relatively quiet. Was that ever an option?
Our church, the churches that we went to, never really offered that. There was a small point in time where they tried to do, one of the churches we went to did try to do like bags for really small children with sensory
Okay.
toys. But, at that point, I was like a teenager and it wasn't available to me.
Okay.
My mom did try to bring, things that were quiet activities to do, but, they get boring when you do it every week
Every week. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
there's not more options.
Yeah. That's the boredom factor is high with ADHD kids. They don't tend to play with one toy for very long.
Mhm.
The fidget toys and some of the sensory stuff kind of keep more engagement because there's more senses at play with it. And I found with myself having a child with ADHD that the more the autism spectrum stuff, sensory stuff I got, the more there was a likelihood of being able to stay in church.
Yeah, there wasn't really sensory toys when I was growing up. Like that wasn't understood. Fidget spinners didn't come until I was, late teens, basically.
Right, right. Well, and I mean, just thinking back too, I didn't realize that my child had sensory overload. When you don't realize that, they'll just get up and run.
Hmm.
So having noise canceling headphones and stuff wasn't seen as something that people should have done, but I think it's starting to get a little bit more acceptable for some kids because,
Hmm.
again, there's so much going on in the service that for some kids who are easily overloaded, they can't really cope with everything.
Yeah, I definitely experienced sensory overload as well. I think to the point where I just would shut down basically because there was no other option for me.
Well, no, that's the only way you were going to survive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not a good feeling. It's not good. It's not very inviting, I guess I could
Yeah.
say.
How did church make you feel? Can you describe some of that?
I guess
How
it
did
was
go? I
very,
should say, how did going to church make you feel?
it was interesting because it's a complex question, I guess I could say. because
Okay.
going to church was something new and different than our regular weekly thing. We
Yep.
would be more around people because, I was in a very isolated environment. So being able to go somewhere where there's other people and other kids was interesting.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I did not interact with them often because I wasn't, in the
Right.
children's services. It definitely felt very isolating. It was hard to be good, I guess, at least what my
Hmm.
parents would consider good, and to participate or just exist, I guess. It was hard to exist in a kind of environment where there was a lot of expectations of acting like a neurotypical adult, because I was
Yeah.
in a service for those people and there was no accommodations. So it felt very hard to deal with. But at the same
Hmm.
time, like, I don't know, I just basically tried my best. When I became a teenager, I had more capacity to, you know, sit through things because
Yeah.
as developmentally you grow, you have that ability more often. And I would just spend time trying to write notes and just to try to pay attention to what was going on and try to piece it together, I guess, because it was very difficult to piece together what was happening and the concepts and the ideas that were being shared.
So I'm guessing with the ADHD that you zoned out a lot in services.
Yes, absolutely. I didn't necessarily listen to a sermon until I was in my mid-teens, so I'll be honest.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean,
It was
it's,
for adults though, so like
yeah, it
not
wasn't geared
necessarily,
really for kids.
yeah, it wasn't really information that I was meant to be absorbed.
Yeah, we kind of sometimes will do a children specific sermon that has like an object lesson or something that is graspable for young children, and
Mm-hmm.
then kind of expect them not to really get the whole sermon and just kind of expect that, as they're absorbing things, it will make sense to them later on. They're
Yeah.
That's kind of the expectation we have that yes, your children are going to move. Yes, they're going to need different things.
My parents definitely did get a lot of looks at some of the churches we went to. The fact that they kept us kids in the service, because they were
Yeah,
like, yeah, why aren't they, in the children's church where they belong, kind of thing.
yeah. I guess, and you seeing that as a kid probably compounded a little bit of the trauma, feeling shameful and
Yeah, I never wanted to be different than other
yeah.
people. I always wanted to be part of the group, to socialize and have community and be able to interact with individuals.
Hmm.
So having a lifestyle that singled us out as a group was
Yep.
very difficult, very isolating. You have
Yeah.
nothing in common with your peers, and the people that you are around aren't your peers. It's very difficult to form any sort of community with anyone. So I didn't have friends basically until I was a teenager in church. And even then, that was questionable. Like there was no meaningful connection with anyone at the churches that I went to.
This is off the topic a little bit, but you talked a little bit about the third space. Asked me if I was familiar with that
Yes.
concept. So I had to Google it. And churches
Mm-hmm.
kind of fill in that third space
They
of
do.
having community. And
Yes.
so one of the things you try and do for your kids is provide opportunities for belonging and for community so that they have more grounding and feel
Mm-hmm.
more accepted. And it can sometimes be really hard for children who are not neurotypical to find communities where they're accepted. How have you found community, or have you found community as an adult?
As an adult, I believe I have found community. It's a
Okay.
small community of basically some of my siblings that I grew up with that
Yep.
have a very similar experience to me, and a couple other individuals that do as well. along with like some of the people that my spouse has, you know, been able to be in community with. There's
Okay.
very few people that don't have some sort of family connection that
Okay.
I have see as friends.
Okay.
So basically, only through family have I been able to fill the community.
Well, I grew up more typical with the public school and then college. And as I've grown older, my community, because I move a lot, has
Hmm.
been more family too. So it's interesting. I see some friends who've stayed in the town I grew up in their entire lives, and they have these deep, meaningful relationships. And I just kind of make do.
Yeah, I am
I,
more
you know,
likely. Yeah, if there are people in the spaces that I bet I'm at, whether it's like work or school, or even not that I really have access to many third spaces, but
yeah,
usually it's all I tend to go towards the neurotypical individuals because it's easier to communicate and we have a lot more in common.
yep,
One of the reasons why I did bring up that concept is because when it comes to generationally
hmm,
understanding things, that concept I think is a big deal because
yep,
I'm in like the millennial generation.
yep,
And for people of my generation, it's extremely difficult to have a third space where you have create community. There's the financial pressure is a big deal in that. A
right.
lot of third spaces that are available have a um, financial barrier to entry. So
Yes,
it's hard to become part of a community where there's an expectation of money. And
exact.
that
Yes,
also can be a difficulty when it comes to church because sometimes they're asking for donations when you're making a sacrifice of your time to go there and sacrifice of possibly gaining resources as well.
yep, yep, yeah,
So that is a big deal. And like honestly, online is probably the closest thing, the most accessible thing that most millennials have for a third space, particularly if they are in the financial, if they're having difficulty with financial things. I
yeah,
think the church needs to be aware of that if they want to reach our generations, our generation.
yeah. The barrier I find is that most most of the generations realize it was hard for us when we started out. What they don't
Mm-hmm.
realize is that for you guys starting out, it is almost a million times harder
Yeah.
because if you talk to a boomer generation in 1968, when you could graduate high school, go work in a factory and support yourself with a car, health insurance, food, and a one bedroom apartment.
Yeah, you can't support yourself on that
Not on
today.
minimum, and that was minimum wage.
Yeah,
And
no, you can't do that.
that can't be done at this point in time. So I often try and tell congregation members who are interested the reason that millennials are having trouble is they can't support themselves on one job, let alone two, because
Mm-hmm.
for Gen X, when Reagan was elected in 1980, so 81, our
Yeah,
social our financial structures changed.
they
And a
did.
lot of Gen X's parents went back to work, and you no
Mm,
longer could support yourself on one family income, but you could on
yeah,
two.
that makes
And
sense.
now you guys are getting the trickle down effect of that, which is you almost need four incomes.
Yeah, that's
And
compounded.
that there just isn't time and place for
No.
that. And it's heartbreaking. I mean, because from my perspective as a millennial or as a Gen X, it's like I can't help everyone. I don't have all the resources to keep helping. And
Yeah.
it is
Mhm.
something that trying to get people to really listen to becomes a barrier. And I'm glad you are speaking out about that because your generation needs to speak out about that. And when someone says it's hard for my generation, say yes, and
Mhm.
this is worse because it
It's
was hard for some. But you
yeah.
can my peers in my generation may have had a parent who stayed home and their father may never have been around because they're working two jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That isn't possible. And that's the structural thing that people need to realize is there are some millennials who are in high paying careers, but that's not the majority. And that's not the
No,
norm. And,
no.
you
And I
know,
think
and that makes it hard.
I think there's a misconception too about like maybe the older generation that goes to church more faithfully, that millennials don't want to be religious. I like that I don't think is the case. I think many
Yeah.
of them don't like how things are structured and maybe it's not available to them. I feel like the biggest issue is the ones that do want to be part of the community are they can't spend the time fighting for what they need in the church because it has that energy has to be put elsewhere. And if they're
Yes.
not listened to, then they can't have that religious community that they
Yeah.
want to be a part of. Like I feel that myself because I like being in community and I want to be in community. But when you realize there's nobody of your generation there, and when you do come, you stand out.
Yeah.
And when you do speak up, you're not understood.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to continue being a part of it because there's just nothing there for you.
What ideas would you have to help make church more accessible or worshiping communities more accessible for people with ADHD? And if you want to talk about millennials as well,
Yeah,
feel
absolutely.
free.
Because thank you. Yes, intersectionality. So for me to parse between ADHD and being a millennial is a little difficult. So I kind of have to talk with them together because they're both very
Okay.
much an aspect of my life when it comes to being a part of a church body. I guess one of the things, like I was mentioning before, having a third space for me personally usually exists. And every once in a while, meeting with like friends that I have or online. Like,
Okay.
so I feel like if churches want to allow more millennials and people of my generation and even people with ADHD to feel comfortable in a community, having online services would be like a huge thing. Because like you can
Hmm.
go online and see online services for many congregations, but there's something
Yep.
different about watching a online service for the church that is like just down the road from you. And then you
Yep.
know that if you needed to, you could go to the church and see the people face to face.
Yep.
It's different. And for a while during COVID, there was more people doing that.
Yep.
Currently, I follow, I guess you could say follow to use a more millennial, younger generation term, a church that is just listen within walking distance. I would listen to their sermons while they were where they were broadcasting them, and they had a thing where, like, I don't know if it was an evening thing where they had a Bible study basically where you could be part of it on Zoom, and just that concept seemed way more approachable to me.
Okay.
The concept of having smaller studies or smaller groups where it's less structured and more conversational is also something that as an ADHD person I find very appealing. I've been
Hmm.
part of Bible studies where it was just basically you take a passage of the Bible and you read it, you study it, and you come and you talk about it. And I feel like that was way more meaningful to be like sitting in somebody's living room where it's comfortable, where there's no expectations of service structure or the rigidity that comes with a lot of church services in my experience.
Okay.
It felt way more like I actually went to church in a way, like what I would be feeling, what I'd expect to feel like after going to hear and to talk about God. So that's a thing that I feel like would be way I would love to see way more churches and communities do is like an outreach online and like maybe follow it up with times where you can go to the actual service like maybe once or twice a year because making that sacrifice is not in every day, every week, every month kind of thing that you can do. For me personally, I feel really anxious in large groups.
Mhm.
Along with my ADHD diagnosis came an anxiety diagnosis as well, which is very common with people in
Yep.
ADHD, with ADHD. So like having that social pressure from the past of, not feeling like you fit in it makes it really difficult to become a part of a larger group of individuals because
Yep.
you don't know if they're going to understand where you're coming from. Most likely not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm feeling that way even especially after COVID and the
Mm,
division that's happened in the US. It's risky to talk about even church stuff and faith stuff because even in churches where we're all quote Lutheran, we
mm,
interpret things differently and people have different political points of view.
yeah.
But I found that the tribalism is a little stronger. And so some people may find themselves just feeling like they're pushed out. And it may be true that both sides feel they're being pushed out. And it's a little harder to connect with people and feel safe doing so in a group.
Yeah, it definitely is. And like there's just particularly with having the ADHD on top of that,
Yeah,
where you don't function the way our society expects you to be able to.
right.
Um, that it just kind of adds to that feeling where like you don't know if you're going to be allowed to be you. I think
Uh,
too, I don't know if it's just the type of Christianity that I've been exposed to. I think there are some that are a little bit different, but just the lack of movement that's allowed to be expressed during worship is very difficult for a person with ADHD.
right,
Like I enjoyed singing because it was one of the few times where you were allowed to use your voice during the
right,
service. Like that was fun for me, but it's very come from like the services and church background comes from a more puritanical point of view where expressing joy through movement was not considered holy, basically. Like it was
right.
of the devil. That kind of concept where like churches are very, I guess what you think, pious. There's not it makes it very unapproachable for ADHD people, at least
Right.
from my perspective. Churches need breaks.
Churches need breaks.
Like even so obviously the church services that I went to were like hour long services or more. And
Yep.
like you as an ADHD person and as a person in our society, focusing for that long, very difficult.
Yep.
And like I feel that just in itself, like if I would love to be part of a service where there is, you know, expressions of, love and emotion, which I feel like is very important
Mhm.
to us as human. And for me, that's part of Christianity is to express love. So and just to be able to I would love to be a part of that with other people because that's a feeling that you don't get with yourself to have
Right.
that like community feeling. And like not in being in a place where you're not allowed to pause and reflect when you need to, or like that's not structured in, it's hard to like regulate if you're getting you know too much sensory stuff because
Right.
like there's that you have to handle like both no movement and then over sensory overload kind of issues with
Right.
for me especially one of the church that I mentioned that I followed basically that for a while the minister until the intern minister because it was during COVID and a lot of things were changing for people.
Right.
She would before starting the sermon after the readings and everything, everybody sat down. She'd have everyone sit for a minute and like she'd be like, breathe in the spirit of God and breathe out peace or something like that. And just something as simple as a moment to just like regulate yourself and get
Right.
and the mindset of to listen was like so important and helpful. And like, yes, it may be necessary for people with ADHD, but I think that's something everyone could benefit from.
Yeah, that's a meditative technique, and it's a technique that you only need like 10 seconds of grounding. It's
Mm-hmm.
either you're focusing on your breathing or focus on a sense of touch or focus a little bit on hearing. I'm doing some of that now, and it's helping a lot. It's especially with, I wish I'd known this technique like 20, 30 years ago.
Is it something that you would that you implement during services?
I never have. This is something I'm totally learning now. And right now I'm on what's called leave from call. So I'm just kind
Okay.
of doing this right now. I'm learning more about trauma and
Mm,
religious trauma in particular. So it's kind of like a study leave. It's kind of a chance to just kind of focus more on listening more.
yeah.
So I'm doing more on threads where I'm reading about people who've had bad experiences with Christianity in particular to learn more about that trauma and what that looks like. And then my hope is one, as clergy, we can learn to be more sensitive and help our
Hmm.
communities be more sensitive, and also offer a sense of healing space for people who have been harmed, with the recognition that people who've been harmed may never feel comfortable being around clergy or be comfortable in a worshiping community as well.
I think like if there's at least something that you can offer people if they want to be religious or be in a community that's centered around religion, that they could feel comfortable. Because I feel, from my perspective, I would love to be part of that. Like, and you just look around and you're like, what is there for me? And it's hard to have it. So I really appreciate you, taking the time to try to figure out what that is.
I'm very lucky and that my synod is being supportive,
Mm,
and because there is a crisis right now in our liturgical churches that there aren't enough pastors to lead everything with the amount of
mm.
churches we have. And that said, a lot of our churches are dwindling so much that there's not enough people to fill the pews and to support a full-time pastor. So I'm lucky in the sense that I'm being released to kind of like focus on this, because we see that worship in America is changing. We also see the rise of Christian nationalism, which is deeply concerning because that's harmful for everyone.
Absolutely.
And we really are struggling with how to outreach to millennials in a non-threatening, non-sales pitch way, authentically
Yeah.
trying to offer community, knowing full well too that as religious leaders, we are flawed human beings who will disappoint you, and
It's
trying to
fun.
keep all of that in the
So when I was,
mix.
yeah, it's like when I was talking with Steven on the topic of like reaching millennials, one of the biggest things that he has is financial support, like how churches approach that. And he's
Yeah.
like, just put it at the next to the door and offering box and don't talk about it. If they ask you, be like, hey, it's there. Also, you can give online.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
And
just like
that's,
that's such a different approach than churches
yep.
have been doing in the past.
Well, and that's a whole nother topic we could spend hours on.
Yeah, but it was just I just
But
throw that in
yeah,
there briefly, where like that wasn't something I was interested in talking about, but
yeah,
just the fact that there were that was just such a thing that people do experience, and it does need to be
yep,
talked about how to approach it.
yeah.
Um,
And usually the way our structure has been, our financial structure in our country has been, you have more money at the end of life than you do in the beginning.
mm, I don't know if that's going to be the case anymore.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge too, because the very end of life, all of your resources end up going to whatever group home you've gone to if you live long enough,
Mm-hmm.
or are passed down to family members if you are not in a group home. But that's
Yes.
another aspect of things too. Like, just because of of how trickle down economics has affected the generation has really impacted what churches can do. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a huge financial crunch in some churches. Now, the mega churches seem to be doing fine. Like, I do not make the money Joel Osteen does. I would not expect to make that kind of money.
I also
Um,
don't want to make the money the way he would. I would assume you wouldn't want
yeah.
to.
But see, what he's preaching and what I do are very, very different. That's one of the challenges too with the progressive movement is we are not in people's faces,
Yeah.
and we don't have like the ad campaigns of Jesus gets us. Like, we preach that, but we would never spend the money to put an ad campaign at a Super Bowl commercial. We would
Hmm.
spend that money to raise for Bread for the World or
Yeah.
for a hunger ministry. And that has been a challenge of like, how do we get the message out? But see, we do things differently. And
I feel like
oftentimes we're too quiet.
that's okay. But like the
Yeah.
thing is, as long as I feel like the mindset of churches is that we're still in a prosperous society, which is not
Yeah.
the case. So I feel like leading more toward the direction of not of like outreach to people within the community would probably have a bigger effect. Like if you know that your church is giving out something in a way that's accessible and you need it,
Yep.
you'd be way more willing to engage or have way
Yep.
more good faith. Because I feel like if you want to build that with people, churches have lost a lot of that good faith because they stopped doing those things, like
Yeah.
those outreach ministries within a community that you can see in a way that's non-judgmental and non-confrontational.
Yeah. And most of the time when I've been involved in things like that, it's been ecumenical, meaning it's been with other churches to try and
Mm,
so that we have the volunteer staff to
yeah.
run the project. And I'm not sure how often, and again, like my one of my big frustrations is I feel like I'm like talking to the choir when I talk to the millennials, and then like I feel like I'm on deaf ears when I'm talking to other people in my
Mm,
generation and above. Is for the last 20 years, I've been like, we need to do the financial structure is not here.
yeah.
Like, we are still trying to offer programs and things as if we have a whole slew of volunteers who can afford to stay home with their kids. And there are some parents who can, but that doesn't mean they have, but other families don't. And
Mm-hmm.
and that structural change has made trying to figure out how to reach out harder. Not a lot of people may know what the needs are of their family members or their communities
Yeah.
because of how our communities are structured. Churches caught the ball when they started seeing women going back to work and started offering preschool and daycares.
Yeah.
But there's a different need now. I mean, that need
Yeah.
is still there, but there's not another need now that's harder to find and name and
The need is
set
less.
up.
I think the need is less for children. Like a lot
Yeah.
of these things are focused on children,
Yes.
and millennials
And when
can't
you're
have
single, you
children.
feel isolated if you don't have kids in a
Yeah,
church.
like you
Yeah.
can't have kids if you don't have the financial like stability.
Yeah.
So you're overlooked and your issues are overlooked.
Yeah.
That kind of leads me to another thought that I wanted to mention about having ADHD and disabilities like that as yeah, people with disabilities. Not that I can speak to everyone, but a lot of time when you see stuff like you're talking about the sensory bags for kids with autism, oftentimes it's okay to have these issues in our society. Thankfully, they're accepting it to some point, but
Hmm.
usually it's only for children.
Right.
Like I'm an adult with ADHD. I
Right.
need sensory things always, not just
Right.
because I'm a child.
Right.
And children on the long might proportionally need it more, whether they have ADHD or not. So like it feels like you slowly get lumped into if you being treated like a child if you have these issues, because that's the only people that are accepted, you know,
Right.
have these
That's
issues.
a good point. Do you have fidget stuff that you can hide in a pocket to take into a place? Do you like
I
those fidget cubes?
I
Because
do
like,
have a fidget cube. Unfortunately, it goes click, 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 click.
yeah. Because I guess
But
some of the thing is that you almost expect that. I think some of the adults, they kind of sneak in things that keep
mhm,
them a little busy. I've known people
yeah,
who knit through an entire service because their hands have to be doing something
yeah,
or things like that. So I think you're right. We need to stop kind of lumping ADHD as a child's only disease or
mhm,
disability or syndrome. But I think we also just kind of ignore the fact that some adults are kind of like doing something, even if it's shaking a foot or if it's moving around to
yeah.
kind of keep themselves on task.
And like if
Um,
you're an older adult, nobody's gonna question you,
right,
right? If you're like an older, like past 50 or something type individual, nobody's gonna question you doing a thing like that.
right.
But if you're
But for your
younger,
20s to your, yeah, or your
yes,
teens,
people will
yeah,
comment, people will give you looks, people will not understand because it looks different for your generation to do those things than
right,
for their generation. So like
right.
I feel like if you're going to offer sensory bags for kids with autism, you should offer a sensory bag for people and adults. Like you should have more options. So and have it like accepted not as a thing because they're children. Like you have to make it for all ages in a way that is opening and like
Hmm.
accepting, because this world is not for neurodivergent individuals. And
No, and
if
I wonder if some of that is why there's so much anxiety among neurotypical or neurodivergent people.
yes, I think it has a lot. I would not be surprised if that had a lot to do with it, along with some of the depression as well. And because like the way our society is set up is not inviting, if you want to be a church that truly wants to show love to everyone in your community and to be a safe place for everyone, you have to be a safe place for neurotypical people along with neurodivergent people. Because and I do have the desire to be part of a community like that, but I
Yeah,
can't approach one very easily because there's not options, you know?
right,
And if the only options there are for children, it
right.
it feels very demeaning, I guess. Like they're looking
Yeah,
down, like your personhood is being looked down on and invalidated.
that's a very good point. Thank you.
I guess one of the things too is like you were mentioning having shorter sermons. I definitely agree with that being a good thing. Do you think there's any um when I was talking with Stephen, I he had this suggestion of basically after the sermon's over, let's short, letting everybody go home, but also if there's somebody that wants to engage with the teaching and the learning, to have like a short time for the few individuals that wish to do that. I think that could also
Yes.
be helpful.
I've often offered that if there's been something happening in society for
Hmm.
people who want to sit and talk more. When Dobbs' decision came down, started the service with, I will be available for folks if you want to talk about this afterwards, because I know
Hmm.
that was a major frustration.
Yeah, because then you can touch very specifically about the topics that were talked about that week. And if maybe somebody has a question about theology of something or how to apply it to their life, or if they just, want to talk to somebody, because I feel like a lot of particularly older generation people don't always have that opportunity, a safe kind of accepting way of doing that.
Any other options you want to talk about before we wrap up? Thank you, Berta, for sharing your story and offering insights into how ADHD affects your experience in a worshiping community. Trauma happens not just from harmful theology and teachings about God, it can also happen when people do not have accessible experiences, especially for people with ADHD or other neurologically diverse people. The embarrassment Berta felt when she had to leave services is a shame response and over time becomes a complex trauma. ADHD is a hidden disability that is often misunderstood by caregivers, by parents, and those who do not have direct experience with managing someone with ADHD. For parents whose kids cannot control their impulses, it can also be an isolating experience. Thank you to our listeners as well. If you would like to share feedback or communicate with us, you can email us at condemnedhappy@gmail.com. That's condemnedhappy@gmail.com. We are on Facebook as Condemned and Happy, or you can interact with us on Instagram and Threads as Condemned Happy. We have 2 blog sites, one on WordPress and the other on blogspot.com. Take care.
Bye.